Stories like this make some people's stomachs tighten at the very thought that they would have to board an airplane, even though statistically it is the safest means of transport. Despite how unnatural flying is for humans, aviation technology does not allow situations in which an aircraft could stray from its route, crash, and certainly not vanish without a trace. None of that can be said about Flight 370. On the night of March 7th to 8th, 2014, a scheduled passenger flight operated by Malaysia Airlines departed from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, bound for Beijing. Over 200 people were on board a Boeing 777, one of the most modern and safest aircraft. An experienced crew, calm weather. The messages sent to the ground raised no suspicions, but after 40 minutes of flight, the radar signal disappears, as does Flight 370 itself. Over the next 4 years, approximately $250 million were allocated to the search. 26 countries became involved in the operation. It was the most expensive search operation in the history of civil aviation. And yet, the fate of this flight remains a mystery. Today, we will attempt to unravel what caused this flight to disappear. But to do that, we must trace every detail. Before we begin, a few terms for those unfamiliar with aviation. The Boeing 777 is a model of aircraft manufactured by the company Boeing. MH370 is the flight number of this particular aircraft belonging to Malaysia Airlines. That is the most important thing to know in order to understand the context of this story. The remaining technical terms will be discussed as they appear. March 8, 2014, Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Final preparations for departure are underway. Passengers pass through security and board the aircraft. The plane passes all pre-flight procedures without objections. Fuel has been loaded, enough for 7.5 hours of flight, about 2 hours more than required for the route to Beijing. Throughout the journey, the skies are expected to be clear, with the exception of a few areas of turbulence, which pose no challenge for such a machine, nor for the captain. Command is taken by 53-year-old Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a pilot with enormous experience, with more than 18,000 flight hours behind him, including on the Boeing 777. He had worked for Malaysia Airlines for 33 years, and since 1998 had been a Boeing 777 captain. He was considered one of the most professional pilots. At home, he had built a simulator cockpit of this model, where in his free time he practiced his skills. As first officer, 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid. Although quite young, he had worked at Malaysia Airlines for 7 years and had nearly 3,000 flight hours, of which 40 were on this Boeing. On the day of the flight, he was performing his final training flight before a planned checkout, which was to take place during his next scheduled route. The flight experience among the 10 cabin crew members ranged from 13 years for the least senior member to 35 years for the most experienced, all considered trustworthy. In addition to the crew members, there were 227 passengers from 14 countries on board, including 5 children. Most of the passengers were from China. It was they who were most looking forward to the flight, as they were returning home. 0040. Lumpur Tower cleared MH370 for departure. From subsequent communication, it is known that at 1 o'clock, the captain reported reaching flight level 350. That is the cruising altitude of aircraft equal to 35,000 feet, over 10,600 meters. Everything according to plan. At 1:07, the captain once again reported that the aircraft was at 35,000 feet. This may seem suspicious, however, although not mandatory, it is a commonly encountered operational practice. Moments later, normality ceases to apply and the questions begin. 0119 MH370 receives instructions to switch to frequency 120.9 and establish contact with Ho Chi Minh. In response comes a brief farewell without repeating the frequency. Good night, Malaysian 370. That was the last recorded transmission from flight MH370. Moments later, the aircraft disappears from radar and fails to establish contact with the Area Control Center in Vietnam. What is meant by disappearing from radar? Radar systems continuously transmit course, speed, status, and most importantly, altitude. There are different types of radar. The first is primary surveillance radar, which works like a classic sonar in the air. It sends out a radio pulse and listens for its reflection from an object. It requires no cooperation from the aircraft. It detects everything physically within its range, but collects a limited amount of data, and has limited range. The second and most important is secondary surveillance radar. It operates differently from classic radar. It does not detect reflection, but sends a query to the aircraft. The machine responds via transponder, transmitting among other things the aircraft identifier, altitude, course, and speed. For an aircraft to instantly cease being visible, it would have to be blown into tiny pieces or literally teleport. Even if it were to crash due to a failure, this could be read from radar systems, unless someone turned them off. 120. The aircraft disappears. The transponder stops transmitting data to the SSR radar. One might think a device failure or a fire occurred, but as we later learned, the independent satellite system also did not send its report, but after some time returned to the network. Moreover, the transponder was turned off exactly at the moment of crossing the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. It was the perfect moment if someone wanted to make the aircraft disappear. What was happening on the ground at that time? After failing to locate the aircraft or establish contact, about 18 minutes later, Vietnam contacted Kuala Lumpur, informing them that MH370 had not checked in after the handover. Radar analysis began with delay. However, at that moment, it did not clearly identify the trace of 370. In the first hours, the airline reported that the aircraft remained on course to Beijing. As later turned out, this was an assumption based on the flight plan, not on actual radar data. In such a situation, when an aircraft does not establish contact and does not appear in the next airspace, rapid coordination between FIRs and verification of available radar data should occur, followed by activation of the appropriate alarm phase. At 7:24, nearly 6 hours after the loss of signal and almost an hour after the scheduled arrival time, when it became clear that the flight would not arrive, the highest formal alert state, DTRESFA, was declared. A search and rescue operation begins. The area of the South China Sea where the aircraft last established contact is searched. The Malaysian Air Force sends patrol aircraft. The Navy dispatches ships to the potential incident area. After 9 a.m., Vietnam, China, Singapore, and the United States join the operation. At that time, it is still assumed that the aircraft may have crashed in the South China Sea. A few hours later, conflicting radar information begins to appear, and information chaos arises that leads to expansion of the search area. More precise analytical radar data are announced on March 12th. They showed that the flight had not crashed there but had left the area. Reports indicated that immediately after the transponder was turned off, the aircraft made a left turn, then continued a maneuver reversing course by approximately 180 degrees, flew over the northern Malay Peninsula, and headed over the Strait of Malacca. According to experts, the course change was continuous and controlled. The turn radius corresponded to parameters of flight at cruising altitude, and the later route was stable at high altitude. This would mean no signs of loss of control. The report does not state unequivocally who performed the maneuver, but emphasizes that the flight path was consistent with controlled flight. Let us consider for a moment what could have caused this event. Does this mean the aircraft was taken over by terrorists? Was it a failure? Or was it the intentional action of one of the pilots? These and other theories have circulated online for years, and to this day, no one knows the exact answer. But before we move to theories, we must understand one more key element of this story. The Boeing 777 was equipped with the SATCOM system, satellite data communication. Every hour, the device sent a so-called handshake, a short signal confirming that the system was active. It did not contain precise GPS coordinates, but it allowed the distance from the satellite to be determined by analyzing the signal response time. It was these signals that became the key. 2:25, the system returns to the network and logs onto the satellite. This could have occurred through manual activation, or as a result of a change in power source, the system restarted and automatically began transmitting data. Every hour, Inmarsat recorded subsequent handshakes. The last incomplete signal appeared at 8:19 Malaysian time. This means that the aircraft remained airborne for almost 7 hours after loss of contact. Based on Doppler frequency analysis and signal propagation time, the so-called Inmarsat arcs were created, possible flight trajectories at a certain distance from the geostationary satellite over the Indian Ocean. Analysis of speed, fuel, and flight parameters leaves only one scenario: a flight south over the vast Indian Ocean, and it was there that the search was ultimately moved. It was one of the most remote and least explored bodies of water on Earth. Over 4 years, more than 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor were searched. 26 countries participated in the operation. The cost exceeded $250 million. It was the most expensive search operation in the history of civil aviation. Advanced sonars, autonomous underwater vehicles, seabed scanning at depths exceeding 4,000 meters. In 2015, on Reunion Island, a wing fragment, a flaperon, was accidentally found, confirmed as part of a Boeing 777. From the serial numbers, it was determined that it was part of the same MH370. In subsequent years, the ocean washed up several more fragments onto the coasts of Africa and islands of the Indian Ocean. This ultimately confirmed the version that the aircraft must have crashed over the Indian Ocean, so searches were resumed, but again ended with nothing. The main wreckage was not found. The black boxes were not found. The heart of the machine, the place where the answer might be, still lies somewhere on the seabed. What force could have compelled the aircraft to undertake this route? The theory widely discussed at the beginning was aircraft failure, fire, or another in-flight accident. But if we take into account the controlled turn, the fact that the aircraft did not head for landing but continued onward, and the lack of communication attempts, the chances of such events are minimal. One might say that landing did not occur because of cabin depressurization, but this is contradicted by the fact that, according to experts, the flight was manually controlled the entire time, as confirmed by minor course corrections. And what about a hijacking? Unfortunately, such situations, though extremely rare, have also occurred. The question remains whether such an event could have taken place that night. In modern aircraft such as the Boeing, the cockpit has multiple layers of security, including monitoring so pilots can see who is attempting to enter. To break through would require considerable force and time, while it takes less than a second for pilots to activate an alarm system that would transmit this information to the ground. One could dismantle the aircraft floor to access and cut off communication systems. But in front of more than 200 people, this is rather unlikely. Besides, there were no demands or other information that could be associated with such activity, and people capable of this do not like to remain without recognition. There were also theories that the aircraft may have been shot down or remotely controlled. The first hypothesis may seem plausible, but it contradicts the previously discussed data, particularly the signals recorded by the Inmarsat satellite, which confirmed that the aircraft remained airborne for many hours until fuel exhaustion. Had a shootdown occurred, the signals would have ceased abruptly. There would not have been a multi-hour sequence of handshakes indicating continued flight. The second theory was almost from the beginning rejected by aviation specialists, because remote takeover of full control over a Boeing 777 under operational conditions is extremely unlikely, especially since independent expert reports indicated that the flight profile pointed to actions taken directly from the cockpit by someone on board. So what remains? Most analyses of this catastrophe lean toward the last of the possible scenarios. Is it possible that one of the pilots was behind everything? Let us look at them more closely. The first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, occupied a seat in the cockpit of a Boeing, one of the most advanced passenger aircraft in the world, at such a young age. He was engaged in preparing for his wedding, had a developing career and stabilizing private life ahead of him, was perceived as ambitious and calm. His father also worked in the aviation industry and must have been very proud of him. It is therefore difficult to imagine that it was he who would have committed the hijacking of the flight and planned such a complicated operation. And what do we know about the captain? Zaharieh Ahmad Shah, someone who knew the Boeing 777 almost by heart. In the community, he was regarded as a professional, an instructor, a mentor, a calm, composed, methodical man. As I mentioned at the beginning, in his home there was an advanced flight simulator. This is not unusual among aviation enthusiasts. Many pilots build such stations to practice procedures, analyze emergency situations, and refine technique. The problem appeared later. After the disappearance of MH370, investigators secured the simulator's hard drive. Part of the data had been deleted. Recovered files showed a simulated route leading far south over the Indian Ocean. The simulator contained many different routes. It was not proven that this was a rehearsal. It was not determined exactly when this simulation was performed or in what context. And his private life? The media reported that his marriage may have been going through a difficult period. There was also talk of interest in politics, of personal tensions, but no farewell letter was found. His finances were in very good order, and no extremist connections were discovered. There was no clear motive, but still, the maneuver performed after the transponder was turned off was precise. A turn of nearly 180 degrees, flight over the northern Malay Peninsula, avoidance of controlled airspaces, further stable flight at cruising altitude. It looked like deliberate action. The flight profile suggested someone who knew the Boeing 777 systems perfectly, someone who knew where one control zone ends and another begins, someone who understood how military and civilian radars operate. Is that proof? No. It is only a logical analysis of the available data. The official report did not identify a perpetrator. It left space between facts and interpretation. And it is precisely in that space, between experience and suspicion, that the most controversial hypothesis of the entire case was born. So many questions, and all the answers rest at the bottom of the ocean. Would that mean the end of this story? That is what they believed until 2025, when the company Ocean Infinity announced that it was ready to return to where others had already stopped searching. It was not this company's first attempt. In 2018, it had already conducted a search under a no-find, no-fee model, without guaranteed payment if the wreck was not found. It did not succeed then. But technology does not stand still. In 2025, a new operation was proposed, more precise based on updated debris drift models, analyses of ocean currents, and corrected calculations of the final phase flight trajectory. The search area was to cover approximately 15,000 square kilometers in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, significantly less than before but with much greater accuracy. Modern research vessels equipped with a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles capable of descending to depths of up to 6,000 meters were used. Each of them scans the ocean floor with high-resolution sonar, creating three-dimensional maps of the terrain. These are no longer searches in the dark, but deep-sea surgery. The ocean in this region, however, is not a flat desert. It is a landscape full of underwater cliffs, trenches, faults, and volcanic structures, depths where pressure crushes steel and light never reaches. Each day of operation is a battle with weather, currents, and logistics thousands of kilometers from land. Contemporary models indicate that earlier searches may have missed the correct impact point by dozens or even hundreds of kilometers. New analyses take into account different scenarios of the final flight: controlled descent, spiral dive, or even brief gliding after fuel exhaustion. Each of these hypotheses changes where one must search. And that is precisely why 2025 was not a return to the past. It was an attempt to close it with new tools. Do they have a chance of finding the wreck? Although the Indian Ocean is vast, it is no longer as unknown as it was in 2014. If somewhere there, in the silence 4 kilometers deep, the fuselage of a Boeing lies, technology today is closer than ever to seeing it. If you made it to the end, now it is your turn. Which of these facts speaks the loudest, and what still does not add up? The comments are open. Subscribe for more.